Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel. Tonight, we begin a long, calm journey into the true life of Shapur II, the Persian king whose reign stretched across most of the 4th century and reshaped the Sasanian Empire. This story is drawn from ancient chronicles and later historical works, including accounts by Ammianus, Marcellinus, Al-Tabari, Ferdowsi in the Shahnameh, and references preserved in Armenian and Syriac histories. Shapur II was born in the year 309 of the Common Era, at a moment of deep uncertainty for Persia. His father Hormizd II had died suddenly, leaving the empire without a clear adult heir and surrounded by enemies watching closely. At the beginning of the 3rd century CE, the world was living through widespread unrest. Old empires were starting to crack, and new peoples were appearing on their borders, searching for a place under the sun. In the West, the Roman Empire was breaking apart from within, and it faced successive crises that left its eastern frontier exposed before the Persians. Rome was going through a phase historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period filled with military coups, internal struggles, and political shocks that made its eastern regions more fragile than ever. In the east, the Sasanian state was still new to power. It had been founded by Ardashir, son of Babak, then expanded by his son Shapur I. At the start of the 3rd century CE, Persia was trying to secure its position as a great power, competing with Rome and imposing its influence over Iraq, Khuzestan, and the lands along the Gulf. But this strong state was not safe from internal divisions. Conflict existed between the nobility, the commanders of the army, and the Zoroastrian clergy, who held broad influence in the palace and in shaping state policy. In the south, the Arabian Peninsula at that time lived a Bedouin life, dominated by movement, herding, and raiding. Major tribes, such as Bakr, Taghlib, Tamim, Ayad, and Abid al-Qais, moved constantly between the Iraqi desert, al-Yamamah, and the old Bahrain region. These tribes carried out repeated raids on the edges of Sasanian lands, sometimes seeking plunder, and sometimes because old disputes kept returning in every generation. These raids were a constant irritation for Persia, because they struck the trade routes between Iraq and Bahrain and threatened the border villages. In the middle of this shifting world, Persia itself entered a moment of political suspense after the death of King Hormizd II. Influence began to spread among army leaders and the great families, and everyone waited for the new heir who would carry the Sasanian crown and hold the reins of power. He would face Rome in the north and the Arab tribes in the south. The region where Shapur would be born was rich with royal palaces, Zoroastrian temples, and schools reserved for nobles. Persian cities such as Ctesiphon, Gundashepur, and Istakhr lived in relative prosperity despite the constant tension with surrounding powers. In that period, religious influence was strong. Fire temples stood at the heart of public life and shaped politics, just as they shaped society. Persian society was clearly divided into classes: kings, nobles, warriors, priests, farmers, and craftsmen. These classes lived under a strict system that separated each layer from the next. Sasanian Persia in that era was an important center of Eastern civilization. Trade routes from India and Transoxiana passed through it toward Iraq and the Roman lands, making it a meeting point of peoples, customs, and ideas. In this tense global atmosphere, and in this region where power and unrest crossed paths, the child was born who would become known as the longest reigning and one of the most powerful Sasanian kings. His name would become a source of fear in the Arabian Peninsula, and he would be written about in Arabic histories as Shapur II. Persian and Arabic sources say Shapur II was born at a moment when the Sasanian state faced a dangerous political vacuum after the killing of King Hormizd II. Horemheb's death opened a door of ambition among nobles and army leaders, as each side feared the other would seize the throne. So the leading men of the state gathered in the palace to consult about the fate of the crown before matters broke apart. The mood felt like the state was hanging between a new life or a possible collapse. Accounts transmitted by al-Tabari, al-Masudi, and al-Yaqubi say Horemheb II had sons, but some were killed during the internal struggle, some were too young to grasp power, and some leaned toward the nobles and did not have the army agreement. In this chaos, an unprecedented idea appeared in Persian history. The nobles decided to place the royal crown upon the belly of Horemheb's pregnant wife, and they announced that the unborn child would be the next king. This step was a clever attempt to prevent any commander or noble from taking the throne, because a king not yet born could not side with anyone. So rule would remain suspended until the child was born, while the affairs of state were managed through a regency council. Old Persian sources, such as the Quadet-Namag and the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, confirm that this story was well known, and that appointing an unborn king was a political maneuver that saved the state from fragmentation. So the unborn child became the official king. He was called Shapur, a royal Persian name often understood as meaning the king's son. When the child was born, the palace received him with intense anticipation. His birth itself was an announcement that the state would continue. The army, the priests, and the nobles all waited for the moment this small king entered life. Al-Tabari reports that Shapur's birth came at an extremely sensitive time. Rome was moving on the borders, Arab tribes were growing bolder in their raids, and the eastern provinces needed strong management so they would not fall into disorder. Shapur grew up in a tightly controlled royal environment. The Persian court held an elite group of tutors, horsemen, and religious men who raised kings. The goal was to shape him into a king of awe from his earliest childhood. Sources say his childhood was closely supervised by senior commanders who tried to hold the reins of rule during his early years. But over time they noticed the child was growing with strength, intelligence, and hardness. He watched them with the eyes of a king who did not want to remain a symbol without power. As Shapur grew, the Sasanian state entered a new phase. Internal disputes calmed somewhat, and provinces returned to loyalty, but external dangers did not calm. They expanded and moved closer to the center of rule. The most dangerous threat came from the south, where Arab tribes raided border villages and plundered trade caravans passing between Iraq, Bahrain, and Yamamah. This first worried the guardians of the throne, then angered Shapur himself when he reached youth. During those years, reports reached the palace about Roman movements on the Western Front. Some Roman writers said the empire feared the rise of the new Persian king if he matured and took power directly, so it watched every change in the Sasanian court. Shapur grew up seeing a turbulent world where conflicts burned, power shifted, and the state needed a king who could impose awe inside and outside. When Shapur reached young manhood, he began ruling by himself. He began to reveal the personality that made history remember him as one of the hardest Persian kings and among the longest reigning. He ruled 70 full years. He restored the state prestige, fought wars with Rome, and led deep campaigns into the Arabian Peninsula. He was given the title that stayed alive in Arabic tradition, Shapur Dhul Aktaf. When Shapur came into full strength, he took the reins of power with his own hands. The first thing he faced was disorder on the southern borders. Arab tribes had long been a true source of anxiety for Persia, even before the Sasanians, going back to the Parthian era. These tribes moved between the Iraqi desert, al-Yamamah, and the old Bahrain, and sometimes attacked villages near the Gulf Coast. They also plundered trade caravans on the desert routes linking Iraq with the eastern peninsula. Arabic sources such as al-Tabari and al-Balad-Hori say tribes like Bakr, Taglib, Tamim, and Ayad were among the most active in these raids. They moved quickly through the desert, making it hard for Persian armies to catch them or seize them. Those years saw an increase in the power of northern Arabian tribes, especially after the authority of the Lakhmids in Al-Hira weakened for a time, that left Persia borders exposed to sudden attacks that did not stop. News of these raids reached Shapur in Ctesiphon and stirred his anger. The state had just emerged from political instability, and he wanted to show the world that Persia could protect its edges. Some accounts, especially in Ibn al-Athir, say Shapur saw the Arab raids as a direct humiliation of the Sasanian state. He treated them as a test of his ability to impose the king's awe, which he believed in absolutely. Shapur did not settle for sending small detachments to repel attacks, as some kings before him had done. He prepared a broad organized campaign meant to reach the deep areas from which the tribes launched their raids, not merely to defend the borders. This approach was new in dealing with tribes, because Persia often limited itself to retaliation. But Shapur wanted to flip the equation and move the fighting into Arab lands themselves. Persian sources say Shapur began by gathering precise information about tribal movements, routes, and seasonal settlements. He relied on spies who blended among trade caravans to learn the locations of water and pastures the tribes depended on. His plan was to know the road before marching, because the desert was not a land Persians entered with such boldness. Once his intelligence was complete, Shapur prepared for a great expedition that Arabic sources later described as one of the greatest Persian campaigns against Arabs in the pre-Islamic age. Reports in Al-Tabari, Al-Yaqubi, and Ibn Khaldun say he gathered a large army and marched to the old Bahrain region. That region included Al-Asa, Al-Qatif, and what is now Bahrain. It was known to the Persians as Mashmahig. Accounts say the tribes were surprised by his arrival. It was not normal for Persians to cross the desert with such a massive army. They say Shapur entered the lands of Bahrain and inflicted a severe defeat on the tribes that met him. Many were killed, and many tribes withdrew toward Al-Yamamah and the inner desert after his blows intensified. Al-Masudi in Muruj, Al-Dahab, adds that Shapur did not stop in Bahrain. He continued west until he reached Al-Yamamah, and he struck its people with harsh battles. His fame spread widely across Arabia, and many Arabs carried his story in poetry and oral accounts. Across the different sources, it seems Shapur wanted a long-term effect, not only a battlefield victory. So he used the harsh punishment attributed to him, which tied his name to it in Arab memory for centuries. After his rule was secure and his power firm, Shapur launched the greatest Sasanian campaign against Arabian tribes in the pre-Islamic era. The reasons were clear. Arab raids increased near the Gulf and the desert edges, cutting trade roads and attacking border villages, and Shapur saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. The campaign began in Al-Asa and the surrounding areas, which were part of the old Bahrain. Tribes there depended on moving between oases and pastures. When Shapur entered with his army, many tribes were forced to fight on land familiar to them. Al-Tabari reports Shapur won several successive engagements. He killed many tribal leaders, and those who survived withdrew to Al-Yamamah and deeper desert regions. Then Shapur continued toward Al-Yamamah. It was a major center for tribes such as Bakr, Tamim, and Ayad. Here the sources narrate the event most associated with his name, the punishment of Arab captives that made Arabs remember him as Dhul Aktaf. Ibn Kathir in Al-Bidayah wa Al-Nihaya and Ibn al-Athir in Al-Kamil fi Al-Tari say Shapur, when he captured an Arab man, pierced his shoulder at a specific place and inserted iron or a rope through it. This punishment was described as a form of humiliation and retribution for the raids that had harmed Persia for many years. From the texts, it appears this was not a single incident, but a policy Shapur used during the campaign. He intended it as a terrifying example to deter others. So the title, Dhul Aktaf, became rooted in Arabic tradition and entered proverbs and poems. Al-Tabari states clearly that this punishment was the origin of the title, and that Arabs trembled at Shapur's name afterward. After this harsh blow, many fled deeper into the peninsula. Shapur pursued those who remained until he reached areas near Al-Dona and the Empty Quarter. It was not normal for Persians to enter such regions, but Shapur wanted to reach the roots of the tribes that had troubled him for years. Al-Masudi notes, Shapur penetrated farther than any Persian king before him. That description indicates the depth of the expedition into Arabia. The campaign ended with Arabs retreating to distant regions beyond Persian influence. The tribes of Bahrain and Yamamah became less able to raid for many years because their losses were heavy. With this, Shapur cemented his authority in the south. Arabs remembered him as a king of severe awe, and many tribes feared approaching areas under Persian rule. After stability in the south, Shapur returned to Ctesiphon to face the second great challenge of his life. It was the renewed conflict with Rome, which played out along the edges of Iraq and Syria, a border zone of constant clashes since the time of Shapur I. After Shapur ended his wide campaign against Arab tribes and returned to Ctesiphon, he found the Western Front heating again. The Roman Empire, which had suffered internal unrest for decades, tried to exploit Persia's distraction in the south to expand influence in border regions. The frontier between the two states, stretching from Nisibis toward Tor Abdin, had been a permanent arena of struggle since the Parthian age. That period saw the rise of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who sought to stabilize his state and restore strength. Roman accounts written by Ammianus Marcellinus say relations between Persia and Rome were constantly tense, and that Shapur II was viewed in Constantinople as a young king who might lead a new Sasanian military revival. After Constantine's death, disturbances in the imperial house increased, making the eastern frontier more exposed to confrontation. Cities such as Nisibis, Singara, and Dara were strategic points for both sides. Historically, Shapur besieged Nisibis 3 times, and this is among the most famous events of his life. Ammianus mentions it clearly, and he witnessed some of these events. The first siege of Nisibis was an attempt by Shapur to test Roman defenses. He did not succeed in storming the city. Nisibis was exceptionally fortified, with experienced Roman leadership, high double walls, and a position slightly above the surrounding plains. Ammianus says Shapur used large catapults and moving siege engines to open a breach in the walls, but fierce resistance prevented that, and he withdrew after a long stand by the city and its commanders. Shapur did not surrender after his first failure. He returned years later with a larger and better equipped campaign. During the second siege, he tried to divert the course of a nearby river to weaken the foundations of the walls. This was a known military trick in that era, but Roman defense was effective, and they repelled the attack again. Ammianus says heavy rains helped the defenders. Water overflow disrupted Persian movement and ruined some of their equipment. The third siege was the strongest and most violent. Shapur came with a great army and was determined to take the city at any cost, because it was the key to controlling the road to Edessa and the west. In this siege, the Persians used deep trenches and huge catapults that created cracks in parts of the wall, but the defenders held firm. The Roman commander was intelligent and managed internal defenses well. The siege lasted a long time, but Shapur withdrew for reasons connected to Roman movements on another front. Even so, the repeated failure to take Nisibis was not meaningless. It showed Rome that Persia had regained strength and that its young king carried major military ambition. Roman sources recorded this clearly and considered Shapur one of the most dangerous eastern kings the Byzantine state faced in the 4th century. Between one siege and another, Shapur seized smaller cities and forts in the Jazira region near the Euphrates, such as Singara and villages on the Kaaba. His broad goal was to push the borderline westward so Persia would hold a stronger defensive position against any sudden Roman strike. Persian reports, especially in histories of Persian kings, say Shapur rebuilt some eastern fortifications and reorganized the army to suit the frontier style of warfare. Conflict with Rome depended heavily on sieges and concentrated attacks, not only open field battles. In Constantinople, Shapur's rise was watched carefully. Socrates of Constantinople says Emperor Constantius II saw Shapur II as Rome's strongest eastern opponent after Shapur I. So Rome needed to preserve a balance with him. Despite many confrontations, neither side could impose complete control on the region. War between them went back and forth, with Persians winning sometimes and Romans winning at other times. But it is certain Shapur proved Sasanian power at a time when Romans suffered repeated internal disorders. While the struggle occupied the Western Front, the Eastern and Southern fronts calmed completely thanks to his early campaigns. Arabs became less able to raid, and the mere mention of Dhul Aktaf became enough to deter many tribes watching from a distance. After the wars with Rome and the stabilization of the Southern Front, Shapur turned inward to Sasanian affairs. His rule was unusually long, even by Persian standards, lasting about 70 years. Across these decades, Shapur did not focus on war alone. He worked to strengthen the authority of the state and organize its institutions so they would be stronger than they were when he first took the throne. Under Shapur, the Sasanian state saw broad reorganization of the administrative system. The Sasanian order relied on dividing the land into administrative units, each governed by a marzban, a border lord, or local governor. After long wars, some areas had lost discipline, so Shapur reappointed governors and chose those he trusted, especially in frontier provinces. He also reorganized the Sasanian army to make it more capable against Rome. Histories of Persian kings say Shapur supported the development of heavy cavalry, one of the most famous Sasanian arms. He increased the royal guard and units responsible for monitoring borders. He kept the army in constant readiness, believing a strong state is preserved only by deterrent military power. Alongside military and administrative reforms, Shapur built a number of new cities. One of the most famous was a city carrying his name, often known as Bishp al-Masudi in Marouj. Al-Dahab mentions it as one of the important cities that flourished in his era. The city lay in a fertile agricultural region and later became a center for trade, craft, and Zoroastrian religion. Shapur also improved irrigation networks in Avas and Khuzestan. These areas depended on rivers and smaller channels for farming, and Persian systems of dams and canals helped wide regions of the southeast prosper. Shapur II was strongly committed to Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the Sasanian state. In his reign, the power of the clergy increased. They held major influence at court and over society. Persian reports say Shapur supported the building of fire temples and cared about reviving traditional rites. At the same time, his period saw tension between the state and other religious communities, especially Christians. During his reign, there were widespread persecutions against Christians in Iraq and Persia. These persecutions were tied to political conflict with Rome, because Rome had become a Christian state under Constantine. Sources differ on the scale and extent of the persecutions. but it is clear they formed part of the religious and political struggle of that era. With the passing years, Persia under Shapur became stable again. He repelled Rome in the west, suppressed internal revolts, deterred tribes in the south, and reorganized rule and the army. This brought the Sasanian Empire into a period of relative prosperity. It is said several Roman rulers fought him or negotiated with him. Among them was Emperor Julian, often called the Apostate, who was killed during an eastern campaign. Ammianus Marcellinus describes that event in wide detail. After Julian's death, Romans were forced into a peace with the Persians, giving up several border cities. This was seen as a political victory for Shapur. Shapur's death was calm compared to the length of his reign and the number of his wars. He died in his city after he had passed 70 years of age. That was in the middle of the 4th century CE. Reports say he died a natural death, without assassination or internal struggle, something rare among kings of that era. After his death, weaker kings followed on the throne, making his era appear even more prominent compared to those who came after. What is certain for everyone is that he was one of the greatest kings of the Sasanian state. His title Dhul Aktaf stayed alive in Arabic tradition because of the severity of his famous campaign against the tribes of the peninsula. And now, what do you think of Shapur Dhul Aktaf? Do you see him as a powerful king who restored Persia prestige and imposed his authority over mountains and deserts? Or do you see him as a harsh man who knew only severity and cruelty in war? Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, and thank you for watching.